At a glittering charity gala, world-renowned pianist Alexander Volkov, brilliant, imperious, and addicted to control, publicly dares a shy, unassuming woman named Maya to play a piano as a joke. What begins as ridicule becomes a reckoning. Maya, who has harbored a secret past as a once promising prodigy and a private language of music learned on a battered upright in a provincial kitchen, answers not by imitating technique, but by opening an incandescent, unexpected voice of music that soothes together memory, loss, and yearning. Her performance unmoors the audience, exposes the fragility beneath Alexander's swagger, and forces everyone into new truths about talent, dignity, and the hunger that hides behind spectacle. The story traces Maya's quiet courage, Alexander's unraveling vanity, and the subtle alliances and betrayals between managers, critics, and the city itself that determine who is allowed to be seen and heard. Cinematic in scope, intimate in detail, the tale explores ambition, redemption, and the power of an honest voice to rewrite destiny. The chandelier above the theater spilled its light like a river of iced glass. It poured down through the tears of valor and guilt into the faces of a city who had come to see itself perform. Philanthropists, critics, socialites, and a banking class dressed in the sheen of good intentions. The program promised an evening of classical wonders, capped, as always, by Alexander Volkov, the star, the myth, the man whose name in the press had become shorthand for inevitability. Alexander arrived like a weather front. He moved across his scene with a sculptor's certainty, a jaw that never betrayed the smallest hint of surprise. Even at 60, his hands were long and nervous, immaculate in the way of habitual polish. His hair, a wintered black, was combed back as if he had a private arrangement with gravity to keep it tidy. He accepted applause as a monarch accepts an audience, formally, and with an air of civil benevolence. Maya sat in the far reaches of the mezzanine, where the crowd thinned to the neat, honest people who preferred being close enough to the artist to feel the heat, but distant enough to avoid the spectacle of being seen. She had been invited by a neighbor who sold her a surplus of charity tickets and a tale of favors owed. Maya wore no jewels, only her grandmother's shawl, small and moth-patched, the color of old tea. There was a softness to her hands, gardener's hands, breadmaker's hands, with a trace of flour that no one in the room would notice. She had not come to be noticed. She had come because she liked the way music walked into a room and rearranged its furniture. In the months that followed the accident at the factory where she worked, evenings of music had been a place of rest. Sometimes she would drift between one song and another, as if following a faint scent. It was simple, a private thing, until tonight. The gala's program had a pattern: speeches, auction, orchestral selections, and then a guest appearance by Alexander, who would, with ritual cruelty and charm, sign programs and give the city proof that its tax-deductible generosity also had taste. He liked, more than anything, to be the axis upon which the conversation turned. When he stepped onto the stage to deliver his customary, rehearsed nod towards civic responsibility, he allowed a smile that could be used in advertisements. He spoke with that voice, a cultivated baritone that sounded as if it had never known hunger. He praised the work of the foundation. He praised the funding. He praised the city that could afford to salute itself. His remarks were a shoreline, polished and safe. Then, in a moment that seemed to surprise even the stagehands, he reached down and tapped the lid of the grand piano. "Let us be spontaneous," he said. "Tonight, let an ordinary person show us what the extraordinary looks like." The word ordinary landed like a pebble in the audience pool. Some applauded, others shifted in their seats, amused. They called for volunteers. A breath of laughter scattered as hands remained politely folded. Alexander scanned the room like a conductor searching for a weak section to make his flourish. His eyes settled on Maya where she sat, an improbable figure in gray among the pumped and sequined. It was a joke. He thought so immediately, the kind of joke that would be told for years. How even the common woman would be played upon and found wanting. He would lift her up as proof of a city's tasteful superiority. He motioned, with the light condescension of an emperor on a grand tour, for her to come forward. Maya hesitated only because her legs argued with each other, routine fatigue. The small rebellion of a woman who had worked 12-hour shifts and been told to keep her voice small. Then someone, a neighbor, a voice she recognized with half of her attention, encouraged her. "Go on, Maya," they said. "It'll be fun." It would be fun for them. For her it would be a small wrong she would turn away from, as she turned away from the more abrasive offers of men who wanted to instruct her in the art of being invisible. The stairs down seemed longer than the ones in her apartment. Her shoes, which were sturdy, made no sound. When she reached the stage, the theater held its breath like a sleeping animal. Alexander inclined his head. A tilt meant simultaneously to invite and to measure. "Play something," he said. His smile was lubricated with the promise of aftermath, a story, a picture in his mind of her failing with dignity, a moment for the cameras to fancy themselves moralizing. "Play what you know." Maya's fingers went to the keys as they would to the edge of a familiar river. With a small, worshipful fear. She had not played in public since she was 19, since she had walked away from conservatory life bent by the ache of circumstance and a father's failing lungs. She had left a bright, painless future of certificates and recitals for two things she could not justify to anyone: a family that needed steady hands and the certainty that, in a town that measured worth by the size of one's purse, her talent had been a poor currency. She had learned, instead, to listen. In the vegetable market, she listened to the rhythm of haggling. In the factory, she listened to the machine's strange harmonies. At home, her grandmother taught her songs that had been stitched on the margins of migration. A lullaby for coal, black mornings, a saying caught between a cough and a smile. These were not the pieces that sold tickets in grand halls, they were architecture made of memory. Maya placed her hands on the keys. The theater expected a stumble, a sentimental two-chord piece, a halting apology. Alexander leaned back, pleased to watch. Journalists poised pen tips like trapdoors. Editors readied the concession of critique before ever hearing a note. What came then was a sound that resembled nothing they had been taught to expect. Maya did not begin with a flourish. She began with a single thread, a low, thin melody that might have been a hum at the edge of a kitchen at dawn. It was a tune she had coaxed from the old upright she had kept hidden behind curtains for years, a tune that had the stubbornness of a root. It was simple, but honest, and it unfolded like a story told by someone who had lived it. As she played, she did not count beats as a conservatory pupil counts bottles on a shelf. She breathed into the tempo, letting it bend where breath sought space. She allowed silences to arrive like windows opening. Her left hand drew a steady, pulsing anchor, the thump of a train, the slow beat of a heart, while her right hand embroidered small, aching figures: a bird, a bruise, the smell of rain on tar. The music had the crooked perfection of a hand-stitched quilt. The theater listened. At first, the attention was polite. Then curiosity sharpened. Then, like a tide, it rose and flooded the seats. People who had come to show that they could afford to be surprised found themselves surprised in a way that cost them nothing and asked everything. Conversations in the boxes evaporated. Chandeliers dimmed against the force of the music, and for a long, luminous minute, the world beyond the theater, the frantic city of deals and small deaths, was irrelevant. Alexander's smile thinned into puzzlement. His fingers were still tucked into gloves of arrogance, but his eyes betrayed the old hunger. A pianist recognizes possibility the way fish recognize water. He found his breath catching in his throat, an unaccustomed sensation that his fame could not accommodate. He had mocked and staged and measured people for decades. He had rarely been caught off guard. This vulnerability irritated and thrilled him. Maya's playing did something else. It told truths Alexander had spent his life legislating against. The music spoke of labor and broken promises, of the smell of boiled cabbage and the white flash of a hospital corridor. It had interior light. It did not clothe itself with varnish. There was no virtuoso display as in a scandal of notes, but there was an authority. Her phrases arrived with the stubborn assertion of things that will not be denied. The audience wept without planning to. A woman 2 rows behind Maya made a dry sound that was both ridicule and release. A child in the mezzanine rested their head on their parent's arm, attentive as a new thing. A critic, who had come with a prepared paragraph about cliché and charity, found the words in his pocket turning cold. Alexander rose. Something inside him responded as if to a private summons. He could not climb onto the stage. Traditions and dignity admonished him, but he left his chair and crossed to the wings. He had not moved like that in years. The steps creaked as if remembering. He stood where the stage swallowed light and, for an absurd moment, made the choice not to interrupt. When the final chord died, it left a silence that was not empty, but thick with the weight of having been met. The applause came in a stunned burst, as if a crowd had remembered how to clap for something that could not be monetized. It built, and then built again, faster than habit could account for. Reporters' fingers found recorders, phones bloomed warm circles of light like fireflies in an orchard. Maya rose from the bench slowly, as if rising from prayer. Her palms smelled faintly of starch from the handkerchief she had carried for years. She bowed without ceremony. The theater seemed to lean forward, wanting her to explain what she had done, to name the piece and the composer and the lineage. Maya had no name for it. It was part lullaby, part memory, part thing that had lived under her rib and now could be seen. That night the press did what it must. It made a story that had a beginning, middle, and predictable end. Prodigy returns, the headline said. Unknown woman brings Grand Hall to its knees. Interviews were demanded. Management teams made phone calls. The city's cultural machinery whirred into action, eager to sort the new into a neat box. For Alexander, the incident formed an unexpected blade of light that cut into a corner he had kept dark. After the gala, in the back corridors, where the heat of the house gave way to the cold clarity of concrete and protocols, Alexander found Maya sitting on a narrow bench, the shawl around her shoulders like an exiled flag. He was not the only one who wanted to speak to her. On one side, a manager with a glossy smile pressed a card into her hand, promising opportunities. A critic asked a useless, invasive question about childhood. A journalist jotted down what they thought she would say. Alexander, however, wanted to speak with a different kind of hunger. He approached not as the monarch, but as a man who had been looked at by something he could not own. Up close, he looked smaller. The certainty in his jaw had softened, not from age, but from recognition, the possibility that he had mistaken influence for affection. You play like you know more than music, he said quietly, without his public actor's intonation. He did not offer congratulations. He offered a probe. Maya regarded him with a directness that surprised him. He had expected gratitude, or flustered confusion, or the kind of empty rubbish that is handed to stars like confetti. Instead, she had the gait of someone used to being observed through the wrong lens. Her hands, when they rested in her lap, were those of a worker. "I know what I know," she said. Her voice was plain and clear, without the thin relish of apology. "Why did you stop?" Alexander asked, the question tumbling out. It was inelegant. It was the question he had a right to ask only if he granted himself the right to pity, which he seldom did. But pity had been a frequent companion to public men, and he had learnt to enjoy it. Maya's eyes narrowed, but not in anger. There was a wall, and she had learned how to move alongside it rather than crash into it. Life, she said simply, and other people's needs. Alexander saw, then, that he had been asking not about destiny, but about justification. His own life, perfumed by critics, by tours, by the magnetic texture of applause, had asked of him only one thing: be more dazzling. He had complied, sacrificing the small human things along the way. He felt improbably ashamed. Still, the world beyond the corridor has its own parlance. Opportunity, leverage, contracts. By morning, offers would be on her doormat like beggars. The city would want to refine her into a product that fit sponsor pages. Alexander had a brand to defend. He had a schedule to maintain. He also had an instinct that in her music there was a rare element he had been missing for years. That directness of voice that did not need to take center by artifice. "Would you come to the conservatory?" he asked, not as an order, but as a proposition. The words were awkward. They had the stale generosity of someone who believed opportunity is always a ladder placed at one's doorstep. Maya looked at him as if measuring the air for an argument she did not want to make. She had left the conservatory once. The memory of its ornamental pianos and the smell of lemon polish made her stomach constrict. She had left because music there had been turned into a mirror that showed perfection, but not life. "I do not want a place at the center," she said. "I only wanted to be able to play without someone making a joke of it." Alexander's brow creased. There was a world in which she could be a great soloist, and another in which she could remain a quiet presence. He felt, absurdly, the urge to both teach her and to protect his territory. He wanted to create for her a frame that would make her palatable to his world. He wanted to crave her without surrendering his authority. But as the days passed and the city worked to fold her into its schedules, something else happened. Maya found herself moving through offers and agents, each one with a promise and a condition. Sponsors wanted her story neat rags to recital, tragedy, to triumph. They wanted her to be grateful, to sign with smiles. They wanted a photograph that could be cropped to look like redemption. She was tempted, not by fame, but by the fact that one small contract could pay for her grandmother's care, could replace the roof that had a leak that ate into the winter. She could, she thought, use this sudden brightness as a service to those she loved. But each time she saw herself framed by a publicist's camera, she felt her music recede into something stylized, like a plant turned into a table centerpiece admired, but stripped of the soil that fed it. Alexander watched this with a practical dread. He was an expert at turning things into commodities. He could see the machinery ready to smooth her into merchandise. It quivered his old desire to intervene, to sculpt her into the kind of artist who would sell out halls and lead the city in certain ways. He could already see the headlines, he could taste the applause. But he also felt a growing, inexplicable loyalty, not paternal, not simply proprietorial, but genuinely protective. He began to attend the little performances she gave at community centers, where she played not for critics, but for people who came to hear the music and take it home in the quiet. He began to watch the way she arranged songs, the small hesitations, the odd cadences that made people cry. He started to think about the difference between someone who performs music to prove they exist and someone who performs to tell what the world has been. His presence irritated some and soothed others. Managers spoke of branding, critics spoke of novelty. The conservatory offered her a stipend and a teaching chair. They promised she could teach classes while also rehearsing for recitals. Maya considered the offer like one considers a warm coat. Practical and necessary, but lacking the weight of one's own skin. Then, in a televised recital that was meant to be her coronation, a carefully produced hour of contrived authenticity, something broke. She was to play the first part of the program, a canonical sonata chosen by Alexander, who had insisted on a traditional repertoire to ensure that she would be measured by familiar standards. Cameras watched every fold of her shawl. The producers had placed small, tasteful shots of her grandmother behind, a tableau for generosity. The world would judge. Alexander watched from the wings, applaudances already rehearsed in his palms. Maya sat at the grand piano. She began the sonata with respect, fingers tracing those old paths that conservatory teachers had hammered into muscles. But at the cadence, at the precise moment when tradition would want courage given to technique, she diverged. The music slipped its collar and turned toward memory. She folded the sonata into a thread of sound that leaned toward the songs she had learned at her grandmother's knee. The audience, schooled to expect a familiar journey, found themselves unmoored. There is a risk in sounding authentic. On a stage that expects polish, one can be misunderstood as rawness, as unpreparedness. Critics prepared their scorn. Sponsors prepared their dismay. But something else happened. Millions of viewers, in living rooms and hospital beds, in kitchens scraping plates, and in buses that never smelled the same twice, felt a recognition. Maya's divergence from the sonata was an act of translation, from notated perfection to human speech. Alexander flinched. He had not planned for this, but by now he had learned that nothing of consequence in music is ever planned. He moved forward until he stood behind the curtain, his face lit oddly, as if someone's hand had turned down the lights of his authority. At the end of the program, the critic reviews were split. Some called her audacious and prophetic, others called her treacherous to the canon. But between critics and sponsors, between contract lawyers and cultural patrons, something else had shifted. The public had found in Maya a mirror. In the aftershock, a young composer reached out to her. A woman with ink under her nails, a habitual skeptic of institutions, and they began to write together. They were not interested in arenas. They wanted to make rooms where music could be rough and wet with life. They took the seeds of classical forms and planted them in city gardens, in refugee centers, on street corners. Music began to follow people again, not to show what they could admire, but to remember what they had been. Alexander watched those gardens grow with a complex pain. He could have been jealous, for a moment he was. But more often he felt something finer, an admission that his long ministry as a virtuoso had been a discipline of the hand. Hers was a discipline of the ear. He had devoted his days to the architecture of how notes should be arranged. She taught him the ethics of why notes must be allowed to be true. Their relationship, initially as brittle as old glass, softened into a candidity that belonged to those who had been watched and found wanting. He confessed, once in a small room after a modest concert, that his arrogance had always been a mask for a deep, private insecurity, an unquietness born of a childhood where applause was a currency of survival. She listened. She said nothing merciful. She said only, "Play because you love what you are communicating, not because you want their faces to tell you that you are important." It took him time to learn the difference. Ambition, he found, need not be swallowed, it could be reoriented. He started to play with less stagecraft and more listening. He began to perform in hospitals, in small theaters, in prisons. At first his staff balked, then, grudgingly, they came to understand the quiet revolution in his hands. Maya, meanwhile, refused the role of commercial symbol. She accepted invitations that mattered to teach, to bring music to people who had never had a reason to think they deserved it. When large halls asked her to return, she chose her repertoire with the same plainness with which she chose bread. She would play the great works, yes, but always with a thread of her own music. The kitchen lullaby braided into a sonata, a factory cadence folded into a nocturne. Critics who had once decried her for breaking rules now argued that she had invented them. There were things lost in the exchange. The conservatory lamented a student who became less producible than expected. Sponsors grumbled over ticket sales that did not rise in a straight line. But the city, a breathing, unpredictable organism, made room. It is stubborn like that. It does not always choose the safe path. The story that began as a joke had become, in the slow accumulation of decisions, a redefinition. The woman who had been asked to perform for the amusement of a clique learned how to hold space for truth. The famed pianist learned how to widen his hearing. The audiences learned how to let music be messy and holy at once. In the end, it was not a single night that transformed anything. It was the cumulative insistence of small choices. Maya continued to wash dishes and mend socks between engagements. She refused, with a quiet stubbornness, to let music become a polite retirement plan. Alexander published a book of essays that read like soft penance, confessing the ways a man can be both brilliant and cruel. They performed once together in a small church off a side street, a space that smelled of incense and lemon oil. The congregation was a wild assembly of those who have been held and those who have been lonely. Afterwards, standing in the doorway, where the light pooled and the night made the street a black ribbon, Alexander took Maya's hand. "I was wrong to make a joke of you," he said, the words falling between the two of them like small, earnest stones. Maya smiled with the slow, irresistible trust of someone who knew what loss could teach. "You told a joke," she said. "But you helped me find a way to speak. We are both better for it." He held her hand as if learning a new chord. Outside, the city breathed and went on. Inside, the piano sat with the same quiet gravity it had always had, only now it was no longer a monument to a single worshipper. It had become, in the hands of honest players, of a woman who had once been asked to be a spectacle and of a man who had learned to be less certain, a place of negotiation. Music, the two of them learned, was less about triumph than about conversation, about listening long enough to what had been silenced and then answering with the only thing that could be truthful: a sound.